give the call to the most honourable member for Flinders.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. My earliest memory of Australian politics was the 5th of March in 1983. I was 10 years old. Laura Branigan, Marvin Gaye, Kenny Rogers and Sheena Easton were in the top 10 playing on 3XY. I should have been in my room, of course, dancing around to Billie Jean at the time, but it's fair to say that my affection for watching election results came into life very early. I'm the only child of a single parent, and that election night in 1983 meant a great deal for my single parent and for what it meant for what she could or could not do for herself and for me. My single parent, my mum, was at that time a doctor, a cardiothoracic surgeon to be precise, a qualification that took her the better part of 20 years to acquire, with undergraduate study in medicine and science over 7 years, 5 years of general surgical training, 2 years as a specialist fellow training at the Alfred, followed by 2 years at the Mass General in Boston and 6 months at the Hospital of Sick Children in Toronto in Canada, before bringing her skill back home to Australia and having me. Having me, of course, was a huge risk for a woman who had just embarked on a career surrounded by men with not too much expectation of women being around, and particularly not forthright, bloody smart women coming into their mix like my mother. As I have explained elsewhere in my first speech to this place, she went to extraordinary lengths to make sure I was safe and fed while she went back to work. My mum took just 2 weeks off when she had me, not because she was desperate to get back to work, even though my mother is the very definition of a careerist woman. She went back to work because she had to. Self-employed, as most specialist surgeons are, no work equals no money. So Mum picked up the plumbing tools, as she would so often describe her surgical instruments, a week or so postpartum, and went back to the operating theatre and the hospital wards. She would take me with her on the weekends to visit the patients on Saturday and Sunday, and in the school holidays I would sit in her consulting suite and in truly terrible handwriting take patients' histories. In hindsight, I thank them for their patience, as I would interrogate their smoking and drinking habits, their next of kin, and diligently write down their telephone numbers with 6 digits. When I got a bit older, sometimes her team would let me into the operating theatre. Fully dressed up in all the garb you need, I would stand on a small ladder and peer over the shoulders of the doctors and nurses and see their remarkable skill at work, with the human form converted into science and art. The patients would wake up an hour or so later in recovery, and like a cheery Oompa Loompa, I would greet them with glee. It was my job to tell Mum that they were awake so she could go in and check on how they were faring. More than once, I think some went back to sleep or maybe just passed out, wondering if they'd been in a dream where the doctors had all converted into midgets. But on the night of 5 March 1983, my mum looked ashen. I couldn't understand why. Mum, why don't you look happy? And as the Hawke landslide rolled in, Mum quietly said, "It's okay, it'll be okay. It's just going to be harder for me to send you to school now." School was, of course, my world, my safe space, my joy, my mates, my curiosity, and a fun park for a galloping brain. But it was also my parent, the parent Mum could not always be because, at least it felt this way at the time, her patients always came first. Every night after school, she would spend hour after hour talking to patients on the phone, the patients, their families, other doctors, oncologists, physicians, and words that would never normally appear in a 10-year-old's vocabulary, like adenocarcinoma, squamous cell carcinoma, small cell carcinoma, mesothelioma. I knew them all. And I knew exactly which words to listen out for to work out whether the conversation she was about to start on the phone after dinner was going to be a difficult one or an optimistic one. You see, my mother did medicine the hard way. She charged patients who were on tough times the Medicare rebate and sometimes not at all. She frowned on colleagues who charged the AMA rates. She watched her earnings carefully, and I realised sometimes later she did so to be able to send me to a good school, a great school, to do some of the parenting she could not always be available to do, so that when she couldn't be there to pick me up from school after play practice or debating or netball, which frankly was more often than not, someone would make sure I wasn't forgotten and got home. Now, don't get me wrong, I should be fair. Liberal to the bootstraps, my mum loved Hawkey. There was something about his large larrikin and articulate brilliance that cheered her greatly. But that night, her pale face was all about what it meant for her ability to make ends meet, and specifically, it was all about Labor's approach to taxation policy. So when I come to this place and talk about Labor's approach to taxation policy and its impact on aspiration, you know it comes from a little kid looking at her mum's face, thinking, Seriously? Could you work any harder? Australia is founded on aspiration. Sure, many were compelled to come here, but most came here willingly for a better chance for them and their family to get ahead in ways they could not in the country where they started out. It's what makes us so successful, having a go and taking a risk. I see that spirit across my electorate of Flinders every day. Small business, independent contractor, tradie heaven that Flinders is. We live well, surrounded by the sand, the hills and the sea, but people work their guts out, and I see it every day. People still want to own a home in Flinders. It's still a common aspiration. Roughly 40% of my electorate own their home, 34% have mortgages, and about 20% rent. High rates of home ownership have excellent outcomes for social cohesion and continuity when it comes to community participation. It's one of the reasons we have thriving footy clubs like the Somerville Junior Football Club. It's one of the reasons we have well-loved and much-used men's sheds like the one I visited in Blairgowrie just before Christmas. And it's why our Rotary clubs are full and fantastic, as demonstrated by the Mount Martha Rotary Club on Australia Day, but also in their generous and constant reach and assistance across the peninsula. And don't get me started on my local Probus clubs, where retired leaders across the spectrum of Australian industry share their wisdom on contemporary issues. I thank the Mainridge Probus for their recent invitation to talk about social media. But with each day, the aspiration of home ownership in my electorate gets harder to realise. On the 3rd of February, the Herald Sun published a table based on PropTrack data setting out what you need to earn to be able to buy a house or a unit in Flinders, assuming a 20% deposit, which is what you need to avoid mortgage lenders' insurance, and assuming a 6.2% interest rate, even though at present some interest rates are as high as 9%. So to buy a house in Somerville, you need to earn $159,000 a year. To buy a house in Crib Point or Tyab, you need to earn $152,000 a year. To buy a house in Capel Sound, you need to earn $144,000 a year, and to buy a house in Hastings, you need to earn $137,000 a year. These are entry point homes in my electorate of Flinders. If you want to buy in Macrae or Mornington, Mount Martha, Safety Beach, Rye, you have to earn more than $200,000 a year. Families striving to buy or pay down a mortgage in Crib Point or Capel Sound are not the rich or the top end, as Labor's demonisation of this demographic would have you believe. They are working their butts off, making ends meet, and yet they are exactly the people Labor would tell you aren't deserving of keeping their own money in their own pocket to use as they see fit. I am so tired of hearing about Labor's tax cuts. It's all we've heard about for 2 weeks. But these aren't Labor's tax cuts. They're the Coalition's tax cuts with some crafty, self-serving, ideological class warfare bait and switch at the last minute, designed to win a by-election in my neighbouring electorate of Dunkley. Here's the sugar pill, 1 July, ignore my broken promises, all 100 of them, to deliver Stage 3 tax cuts in full. Ignore my broken promises on energy bills, which I told you you'd get a $275 discount, and ignore my promise back in 2018 to electrify the rail line to Baxter. Let me read you the Prime Minister's press release dated 31 July 2018, bless him, because it's still on his website, where Anthony Albanese, Shadow Minister Infrastructure, said, "A Labor government will move quickly to deliver the much-needed Frankston to Baxter rail upgrade, building on the significant investment of the Andrews Labor government has made in Frankston infrastructure. Federal Labor is an advocate of the electrification and duplication of the Stony Point line to Baxter to improve train services for commuters in Dunkley and on the Mornington Peninsula. In 2016, Federal Labor committed funding for a business case to ensure the project would proceed as soon as possible upon the election of a Federal Labor government. Currently, thousands of Dunkley and Peninsula residents drive and park at Frankston, Cananook and Seaford stations because the Metroline service ends at Frankston. A Federal Labor government will electrify and duplicate the track to Baxter, giving commuters better access to high-quality public transport and park-and-ride options."
That's good.
Sounds great, but the Prime Minister cancelled funding for this project, all $225 million that the Coalition had provided for it back in budgets past, after his 90-day review that then became a 200-day review, and he snatched $300 million out of infrastructure from the Mornington Peninsula to pad highways somewhere around the current Infrastructure Minister's electorate of Ballarat. couple of weeks ago, though, I joined the Leader of the Opposition, Peter Dutton, together with our sensational candidate for the by-election in Dunkley, Nathan Conroy, to announce a future coalition government would provide up to $900 million to electrify the rail line and reduce parking congestion around Frankston. It will also provide study and work opportunities for my residents in Baxter and, in time, further down the Stony Point line. Here we are, fixing yet another broken Albanese government promise, like the 100 promises he made before to keep Stage 3 tax cuts in full. Today, on the front page of The Australian, we read that Labor's deception will hit the middle ground, not the super rich or the top end, as the Prime Minister would like you to think the tradies, subbies, landscapers and small business families in my electorate are. Patrick Cummins and Jeff Chambers write on the front page of The Australian today. Analysis by The Australian reveals that sparkies, paramedics, police officers and accountants will be long-term losers under Labor's Stage 3 tax changes. As a major credit rating agency says Anthony Albanese's revamped tax cuts will likely be more inflationary than Scott Morrison's original plan. Under Labor's tax changes, electricians, school principals, cops, train drivers and others will pay more tax under the proposed legislation in a decade's time. Bigger tax cuts for middle-income earners promoted by the Prime Minister and Jim Chalmers are projected to erode over time as bracket creep captures more Australians under a higher 37-cent tax rate. In 10 years, Australians earning the equivalent of $104,000 today will be worse off under Labor's redistribution of the tax relief. Oh dear, the truth comes out again. Labor deceived the Australian people when it went to the election in May 22 with a suite of what can only be called liberal-light propositions. As we have seen over the last year, can you trust Labor on energy policy? No. You cannot. As we have seen over the last few months, can you trust Labor on defence or national security or community safety? No, you cannot. And as we will see with this bill today, can you trust them on taxation policy? Absolutely not. No, you cannot. Add to that the avalanche of industrial relations and employment changes designed to stifle innovation, risk-taking growth and productivity into the small and medium business sector. In this place, the Minister for Employment, Tony Bring Back the Beeper Burke, is single-handedly but encouraged and abetted by his union masters, strangling the lifeblood of Australia's small business sector, crushing ambition and that great Australian courage in having a go and creating an opportunity for others. The opposition will not oppose this bill. After all, without the opposition and its 9-year term of careful management of the Australian economy, there would be no tax cuts today. I can't remember the last time Labor delivered tax cuts. I do vaguely remember Prime Minister Paul Keating reassuring the Australian people that the tax cuts he promised weren't just a promise before the 1993 election, they were the law, L-A-W law. But then, in what appears to be a crafty but now customary switcheroo for the Australian Labor Party, Keating went off to the National Press Club after the election, told everyone he'd have another think and that it couldn't be done anymore. Does that sound familiar? The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, equally said he had a mandate for this change to the legislated tax cuts programmed by the Coalition. And how did he get the renewed mandate? He went down to the National Press Club. Well, blow me down. If you could just fundamentally break a contract with the Australian people by going to the Press Club, why didn't anyone tell us? Last time we decided to change taxation policy, we gave the electorate the chance to throw us out, both at the 1998 election, at which the proposed GST introduction was made clear to the Australian public and the choice they had, and then immediately afterwards at the 2001 election. That is transparency. That is accountability. And in that, the Australian Labor Party has a lot to learn.